Thanks very much, Kat and Alex, for inviting me. So the book itself is about the politics of human rights in struggle against harm generated by the ordinary operations of capitalism. Now, some of you will be familiar with the various criticisms of human rights, that human rights aren't getting at the root causes of harm generated through the ordinary operation of political economy. There are various critiques that would say, well, human rights are inherently complicit with capitalism, with colonialism, and or with an ideology of neutral rule of law, which is, the latter is a particularly important emphasis of the book, so the subtitle is Violent Legality and the Politics of Rights. And by violent legality, I'm getting at the ways in which how law is constitutive of social relations, whereas human rights advocates will often talk about, well, you know, the rule of law is there to protect us, but also exploitation, plunder of resources, ecological devastation around the world has occurred not just despite the law, but because of it. And although regimes isn't a concept it's particularly important to the book, I did go through the manuscript and look at that. Actually, I'm using it quite a lot to make sense of the law as a form of institutionalized ordering that exceeds and perhaps precedes states. And law has historically constituted what Brenner Bandar calls colonial regimes of property, that word popping up again. And now my particular focus of this book is on a neoliberal regime of international economic law, which privileges property rights and the sanctity of contracts above all else, and which has become constitutionalized at a global level and very much feeds into domestic legality. And at the same time, law, including human rights law, has been constructed in such a way as to make harm caused by capitalism illegible as a form of injury for which anyone can be held liable, and responsibility becomes individualized. So particularly with the sorts of examples I'm looking at, not only is it, you know, the individual who pulled the trigger is the perpetrator of human rights abuse, but also the corporation is itself a legal structure designed so that shareholders and bosses are protected from having to take any responsibility for the consequences of their involvement. Relatedly, a related critique of human rights, and this is the struggles for the human part of the title of the book. Human rights are said to naturalize a concept of the human as sovereign, as self-interested, with nature at his disposal, which has been shaped through the degradation, exploitation, and dehumanization of colonized peoples, who are deemed not fully human because they don't conform with this understanding of humanity. But at the same time, are human rights something that we can't not want? And is it possible to appeal to human rights without foreclosing on other possibilities, without foreclosing on forms of political economy that might be more enabling of human and non-human flourishing, and perhaps even in the face of climate crisis of our collective survival? And so what I do in the book is try and take a fresh approach to this question through what I call as an ethnographically infused blend of political philosophy and critical theory that comes out of my own engagement over the last 20 years or so with a network of peasant, worker, and indigenous movements in Colombia. This comes out from my life pre-academia, where I was involved for quite a long time with an international network that was set up on a principle of horizontal relations between peoples and was trying to bypass quite a lot of the more colonial aid-giving humanitarian politics of NGOs. I won't talk in depth about that now, but just to say the book itself isn't a book about Colombia. It's a political inquiry, on the one hand, into the politics of human rights as a vocabulary of resistance, but it's also an ethical inquiry into human possibilities and political imaginations in the face of atrocity and devastation. But what I think is most distinctive about it is that it's putting struggles against extractivist capitalism at the forefront of ethical and political reflection. And so as a result, I'm telling a different story, both from those who embrace human rights, but also from critics who reject human rights as just complicit with capitalism, with colonialism, with an ideology of rule of law. And I argue that the idea that we decide for or against human rights only really makes sense when we bypass the politics of struggle. So the book makes two main contributions, one of which I think does speak to the question of regimes. So the first, just tenuously getting it in there, the first contribution is the diagnosis of what I think has become a predominant approach to human rights since the 1990s. And what I argue is that when human rights are yoked to existing structures of power, it's not because they're inextricably tied to liberal individualism, it's not because they inherently are going to inculcate some kind of docile subjectivity, but because of ways in which they're taken up as abstract values which can then be fixed neatly within an existing order of things, so that human rights become add-ons to the tyranny of what I argue is a deeply authoritarian regime of international economic law, which has been designed to facilitate plunder through the mechanism of multinational corporations as motors of capital accumulation. So just briefly on this, since the neoliberalism, there's a lot of recent intellectual histories of neoliberalism looking at how neoliberalism was actually conceived as a moral and legal project. So work by Jessica White and Quinn Slobodian's been looking at this, and how the World Trade Organization, was set up very much based on a vision of rule of law, based on Friedrich Hayek's understanding of what the rule of law should be. And what I argue is that this has actually gone alongside not simply the reduction of human rights to rights of property and so on, but actually an ethics and the emergence of a regime of what I call privatized human rights. As I say, regimes isn't a key concept in the book, but it's interesting, I think, that it is a word, certainly, that I couldn't avoid using, both to think about law in terms of institutionalized forms of order building that exceed states, and I wonder, actually, I was thinking Ant's idea of a silent statism also perhaps imbues a lot of the ways in which regimes get talked about, and the law as constitutive of political economy, I think it's very important then to think about how are there different regimes of legality. But I also, and this relates to what Ant was saying about the regimes of knowledge as well, I also think about, well, how is legality in its different permutations underpinned by specific moral economies and regimes of representation, which are inherent to how law then functions as a form of institutionalized ordering. And what I argue is that from the 1990s, we start to see this emergence of a regime of privatized rights, which is sort of separated from law. So in voluntary corporate social responsibility, global framework agreements, which are voluntary agreements between global unions and transnational corporations. These have started to be constituted as a sort of ethical regime, rules and norms that perhaps determine the ways in which we relate, trying to think of it in relationship to the conversations that we've been having here. But what's important here is that the subject of rights is no longer even a citizen of a state, but a stakeholder within corporate operations. And that's not to romanticize citizenship or to valorize statehood, but simply to point out that the ways in which human rights have increasingly been configured have actually usurped the economic and social rights of citizenship that many social organizations that I've worked with have appealed to in their struggles. So what you actually then have is there's no tension between human rights as enshrined within national constitutions that might be talking about economic and social rights, and this neoliberal regime of international economic law, but actually rights become not limits, but just add-ons to a conceptualization of a rule of law as a neutral, merely technical means of encasing wealth and the rights of investment. And what I argue is that this regime of privatized rights actively bolsters the legal and moral frameworks in which corporations are free to generate premature death. And I argue that through my own engagement, in particular with a peasant organization. I worked with an organisation that was set up by peasant leaders who'd been displaced from around BP's oil fields, and we collectively wrote a book together and looked at how this regime of corporate social responsibility had actually made it easier for those who contested corporate operations to be killed. Because then they can be said to be, well then, the corporation is ethical, the corporation is promoting these human rights of stakeholders. These are not stakeholders. These are people who are unethical and uncivilized. So one key contribution of the book is a diagnosis of this scenario. And I argue that this is inseparable from a prevailing approach to ethics, the cosmopolitan ethics, within a lot of NGOs and campaign groups, as this sort of feel-good project based on a fetishism of abstract values, so that these values can then be very easily harnessed to other equally abstract categories of social and humanitarian policy speak. And then, at the same time, the other aspect of the book, right, is that, is to say, well, look, this isn't the full story. And what I'm really interested in, again, through my engagement with these movements, is how human rights are used, perhaps you might say, in these sort of transversal and disruptive ways, sort of neither in nor out, but as tools of immanent critique. And I'm interested in the power of moments of rupture, which I've looked at sometimes in international human rights litigation, but also in alternative justice mechanisms like the Permanent People's Tribunal, in which dominant legal narratives are subtly subverted through the use of legal arguments. Or movements use human rights as a party in conflict to the state in building their own life projects, to call the state to account for genocidal dispossession. And part of this aspect of the book is thinking about what I call counter-legalities. So particularly in alternative justice mechanisms, what you find is that that social movement lawyers and judges are using theoretically cogent legal arguments to reveal the impossibility of remedy within the existing legal and political economic order. So, for example, reworking international law on genocide and genocidal intent to say, look, actually, if we look at the operations of this multinational corporation and how it's brought about, an indigenous group close to extermination, then we have to say this economic model is inherently genocidal, and yet this meets the criteria of genocide. And yet, at the same time, human rights are also used not just in formal means of litigation and alternative justice mechanism, but also in pursuit of what I talk about as in pursuit of other ways of being human. So they're very closely tied, these litigious struggles and uses of rights, to labour union politics, processes of mutual aid, which again exceed the state and law, but also the struggles of rural populations to reclaim territory and build forms of life that are less predatory and which seek to involve everybody in a much more horizontal way, in building a life project. It's called planes de vida, plans of or for life. And what's really important about these processes is that there's no fixed solution. This isn't about saying, well, we're going to build an anarchist society or a communist or a socialist society. This is like, we're going to start within a process of immanent critique of development, of the law, of human rights. We're going to be, as a party in conflict to the state, and seeking to re-describe what it is to be human quite explicitly, away from sovereign and self-interested subject at the heart of development discourse. So one concept that's really important here is the idea of buen vivir, which is a living well together, an idea that comes out of indigenous cosmovisions of the Andes, which connotes harmonious relations between humans and nature. And as Anne also talks about, there's a real danger of fetishism of a lot of these concepts. And I think what's really interesting in how this is appealed to within these struggles is that, buen vivir is not a finished category. I mean, that's a quote from one of the networks of social movement organizations. It's a horizon of desire that implies an ethical and spiritual code of conduct towards one another and towards non-human life. And it features, within social movement analysis alongside Marxist critique of political economy, alongside anarchist ideas, feminist ideas, in a way that really embodies plurality. And is part of building another ecology of relations based on, building, something that maybe is quasi-legal, and that's something, might be interesting to talk about in the discussion, on the idea of codes of conduct towards one another and towards nature, which are actually then written down within these communities, which exist alongside appeal to human rights as means of protection, as means of conflict with the state, as means of, as a limit on what can be done. And so what I try and do at the end of the book is then to sort of situate this within perhaps what we can think of more broadly is a different approach to ethics. And I argue that there's a sense of good to which these struggles appeal, which isn't rooted in ideas of an inherent human dignity or qualities of the human deemed to be morally valuable, as it is within traditional attempts to ground human rights. But there's what I call an insurgent humanism at play here, in which there's a sense of good, which, on one level is quite spiritual. There's no vocation to sort of capture, to be caught within language, but it's known through this process of immanent critique, through a sensibility to the effects of power and violence, but also through a kind of loving attention to the world and as a prefigurative attempt to build from below.
Thank you very much.